On the morning of May 19, 1536, a woman knelt on a scaffold inside the walls of the Tower of London. 3 years earlier, she had been crowned Queen of England. She had worn the crown jewels. She had given birth to a princess who would one day become one of the greatest monarchs in English history. Now she was blindfolded on her knees in front of a small crowd of witnesses waiting for a swordsman brought over specially from France, because the king believed a sword was a quicker, more merciful death than an axe. Her name was Anne Boleyn. And 11 days earlier, she had been the King of England's lawful wife. She was executed for adultery, incest, and plotting to murder her own husband, charges involving 5 different men, including her own brother. Here's the part that should stop you in your tracks. Most historians today believe none of it was true. Not one piece of solid evidence. Confessions extracted under conditions we'd now call coercion. A trial where the jury was handpicked by the very man who wanted her dead. And a king who 11 days after watching his wife's head come off, married someone else. So what actually happened to Anne Boleyn? Why did a king who tore his country away from the Catholic Church, defied the Pope, and reshaped the future of England, all so he could marry this one woman, turn around and have her executed less than 3 years later? This is a true story. Every date, every name, every document I'm about to reference is real and verifiable. No embellishment needed, because the real story is already stranger than fiction. If you like real royal history, the kind that actually happened, with actual court records and actual consequences, subscribe now, because we're about to spend the next 40 minutes inside one of the most consequential trials in English history. Let's start at the beginning. To understand Anne Boleyn, you first need to understand the man she married and the wife he already had. King Henry VIII ascended to the throne of England in 1509 at the age of 17, following the death of his father, Henry VII, the very king who had founded the Tudor dynasty after defeating Richard III at Bosworth Field in 1485. Henry VIII inherited a kingdom that was, by the standards of the day, unusually stable. What he did not inherit, at least not for a long time, was an obvious answer to a problem that would consume the rest of his reign: a male heir. Shortly after becoming king, Henry married Catherine of Aragon, the daughter of the Spanish monarchs Ferdinand and Isabella, and the widow of Henry's own late brother, Arthur. The marriage required special papal permission because of that prior connection to his brother, a detail that would matter enormously decades later. For years, the marriage between Henry and Catherine appeared genuinely happy. Catherine was intelligent, devout, and politically capable. She would later successfully act as regent of England, while Henry campaigned in France. But the marriage produced only one surviving child, a daughter, Mary, born in 1516. Catherine suffered multiple miscarriages and stillbirths, and by the mid-1520s it had become painfully clear that she would likely not bear Henry a living son. This mattered enormously in 16th century Europe. England had never had a long, stable reign under a queen regnant the closest precedent. A woman named Matilda, who tried to claim the throne in the 12th century, had triggered a vicious civil war known as the Anarchy. Henry and most of his advisors genuinely believed that a female heir would risk plunging England back into chaos. Henry became increasingly convinced that his marriage to Catherine was cursed, pointing to a passage in the book of Leviticus that warns against marrying a brother's widow and interpreting his lack of a son as divine punishment. This obsession with securing a male heir is the single most important engine driving everything that happens next. Keep it in mind, because everything Henry does for the rest of his life, including everything that happens to Anne Boleyn, traces back to this one anxiety. By around 1526, Henry had begun pursuing a young woman at court named Anne Boleyn. Anne was not, by the standards of the English nobility, an obviously spectacular match. Her father, Sir Thomas Boleyn, was a successful and ambitious courtier and diplomat. But the Boleyns were considered solidly gentry respectable, well-connected, but not a family anyone expected to produce a queen. What Anne did have was an unusually sophisticated education, even by the standards of noble daughters. As a teenager, she had spent years at the courts of the Netherlands and then France, serving in the household of Queen Claude of France, where she absorbed continental fashion, wit, music, and importantly, exposure to early reformist religious ideas that were beginning to circulate in parts of Europe. By the time Anne returned to the English court around 1522, she was, by contemporary accounts, magnetic, not necessarily a classical beauty. By the standards of the era, some accounts describe her as having a somewhat sallow complexion and being less conventionally attractive than her own sister, Mary Boleyn. But strikingly intelligent, quick-witted, fashionable, and confident in a way that clearly set her apart at court. Here's a detail worth knowing. Henry VIII had already had an affair with Anne's own sister, Mary Boleyn, years earlier, and there is long-standing historical debate about whether one or both of Mary's children were secretly fathered by Henry, never officially acknowledged. So when Henry began pursuing Anne around 1526, this was not his first entanglement with the Boleyn family. What made Anne different, and this is the detail that changes the entire trajectory of English history, is that she refused to become his mistress. Henry had had mistresses before, including Anne's own sister. It was, uncomfortable as it sounds today, a fairly normalized arrangement at royal courts of this era. But Anne, whether out of genuine principle, ambition, shrewd strategy, or some combination of all three, refused to sleep with the king unless he married her. This single decision, Anne Boleyn holding out for marriage, instead of accepting the traditional role of royal mistress, is arguably one of the most consequential personal choices in English history, because it forced Henry into a corner. He was already married to Catherine of Aragon. If he wanted Anne, he needed an annulment. And getting that annulment would end up requiring nothing less than tearing England away from the authority of the Pope. What followed became known at the time as the King's Great Matter, Henry's years-long campaign to have his marriage to Catherine of Aragon annulled. Henry's argument, built on that Leviticus passage, was that his marriage to Catherine had been invalid from the start, because she had briefly been married to his late brother Arthur. Catherine, for her part, always maintained that a marriage to Arthur had never been consummated. Arthur died young, only months after their wedding, meaning there was no genuine impediment to her later marriage to Henry. Normally, a king seeking an annulment would appeal to the Pope, and in an earlier era, this kind of request might have been quietly granted annulments for politically inconvenient royal marriages were not unheard of. But Henry had catastrophically bad timing. In 1527, the year he formally began pursuing the annulment, the armies of the Holy Roman Emperor Charles V, who happened to be Catherine of Aragon's own nephew, had just sacked Rome and effectively held Pope Clement VII as a captive. The Pope was in no political position to grant an annulment that would humiliate the Emperor's aunt, no matter how much canon law argument Henry's lawyers produced. For 6 years, Henry pursued every avenue. Papal legates were sent to hear the case in England. English and European universities were consulted for legal opinions. And Cardinal Thomas Wolsey, Henry's chief minister, was tasked with securing the annulment. Wolsey failed. In 1529, Wolsey was stripped of his political power, and he died in 1530 while facing charges of treason, one of the first casualties of Henry's growing frustration. By the early 1530s, Henry had run out of patience. He turned to a new set of advisers, most significantly Thomas Cromwell, a brilliant and ruthlessly effective lawyer and administrator who would become the second most powerful man in England. Cromwell's solution was radical. If the Pope would not grant Henry what he wanted, then England would simply stop recognising the Pope's authority altogether. Between 1532 and 1534, a series of parliamentary acts engineered largely by Cromwell systematically dismantled the authority of the Roman Catholic Church in England. The Act of Supremacy, passed in 1534, formally declared King Henry VIII to be the supreme head of the Church of England, completely independent of Rome. This was nothing short of a religious revolution, and it happened in large part because one king wanted to marry one woman who had refused to become his mistress. By January 1533, Henry and Anne had already secretly married while Henry was still technically married to Catherine, because the English Church had not yet formally ruled on the annulment. In May 1533, the newly appointed Archbishop of Canterbury, Thomas Cranmer, handpicked by Henry specifically because he supported the annulment, formally declared Henry's marriage to Catherine of Aragon null and void, and confirmed the marriage to Anne as valid. Anne was crowned Queen of England on June 1st, 1533, in a lavish coronation at Westminster Abbey. She was already visibly pregnant. On September 7th, 1533, Anne gave birth. Everyone at court, and Henry himself, had confidently expected a son. Astrologers and physicians had reportedly assured Henry a boy was coming. Instead, Anne gave birth to a daughter. They named her Elizabeth. Of course, in one of history's great ironies, that daughter would grow up to become Queen Elizabeth I, one of the most celebrated monarchs in English history, ruling for 45 years and presiding over what's often remembered as a golden age of English culture, exploration and stability. But in 1533, nobody could have known that. In that moment, the birth of a daughter instead of a son was, in the eyes of the entire Tudor court, a serious disappointment, and worse, an ominous echo of exactly the problem Henry had spent 6 years and torn his country away from the Catholic Church trying to solve. The pressure on Anne to produce a male heir was now immediate and immense. Over the next 2.5 years, Anne became pregnant at least 2 more times. She suffered a miscarriage in the summer of 1534. Then, most devastatingly, in January 1536, Anne miscarried a male fetus, reportedly around 15 weeks along, just days after the death of Catherine of Aragon, who had died on January 7th, 1536, still in exile from court, still insisting to her death that she was Henry's only legitimate wife. Contemporary accounts, including from the imperial ambassador Eustace Chapuys, a hostile but extremely well-informed observer at court, whose detailed dispatches back to Emperor Charles V are one of our best surviving sources for this period, suggest Henry was devastated and furious after this second miscarriage, and that his affections had by this point already begun shifting toward one of Anne's own ladies-in-waiting, a quiet, unassuming young woman named Jane Seymour. Anne, meanwhile, was becoming increasingly politically vulnerable. She had made powerful enemies at court through her sharp tongue, her strong personal influence over religious reform policy, and her open clashes with Thomas Cromwell, the very man who had helped engineer her rise to the throne, and who would soon engineer her downfall. In April and early May of 1536, events moved with terrifying speed. On May 1st, 1536, Anne and Henry attended a jousting tournament together at Greenwich by all accounts, appearing perfectly normal in public. That same day, Henry abruptly left the tournament early alongside a small group of attendants. It's widely believed this is roughly when Henry was first shown, or acted on, allegations against Anne. The very next day, May 2nd, 1536, Anne was arrested and taken to the Tower of London, the same fortress where she had stayed the night before her coronation just 3 years earlier, now arriving as a prisoner instead of a queen. The charges brought against her were staggering. Adultery with 4 separate men of the court, a court musician named Mark Smeaton, and 3 courtiers, Henry Norris, William Brereton and Francis Weston, as well as incest with her own brother, George Boleyn, Viscount Rochford. On top of all of this, she was accused of conspiring with these men to plot the king's death, which under the treason laws of the time made the charge not merely adultery, but high treason against the crown itself. Let's look at what we actually know about the evidence, because this is where the case falls apart under scrutiny both to many historians today, and honestly, to many observers even at the time. Mark Smeaton, the court musician, was the only one of the accused men who ever confessed to adultery with the Queen. His confession came after being interrogated at Thomas Cromwell's private house, not in the Tower under formal process, and there is long-standing historical suspicion, though not definitive proof, that his confession may have been extracted under threat or even torture. Notably, Smeaton never withdrew his confession, even at his execution, while all 4 other men, including George Boleyn, maintained their complete innocence to the end. Even facing death, the specific dates and locations listed in the official charges were, in several cases, later shown to be provably impossible. For instance, some of the alleged encounters were dated to times when Anne can be independently documented through court records as being in a completely different location, in one case having recently given birth and still recovering, making the accusation physically implausible. The trials themselves were swift, and by modern legal standards deeply compromised. Anne and George Boleyn were tried by a jury of peers, a court of noblemen, but that jury was presided over by none other than Thomas Boleyn, Anne and George's own father, who, in a detail that still stuns people today, was compelled to sit in judgment over his own children, though he did not actually vote in the final verdict. The 4 commoner co-defendants Smeaton, Norris, Brereton and Weston had already been tried and convicted days earlier on May 12th, providing a pre-built narrative of guilt before Anne's own trial even began. Anne and George were tried on May 15th, 1536, inside the Tower of London. Anne conducted herself, according to multiple contemporary witnesses, including the hostile ambassador Chapuys, with remarkable composure and sharp, articulate self-defense. But the verdict had almost certainly been decided before the trial began. Both Anne and George were found guilty and sentenced to death. The 4 men convicted alongside her Smeaton, Norris, Brereton and Weston were executed on May 17, 1536. George Boleyn was executed the same day. That same day, in a detail historians still find remarkable, Archbishop Cranmer formally annulled Henry and Anne's marriage, meaning that, on paper, Anne was executed 2 days later as a queen who had, according to the Church's own new ruling, technically never legally been married to the king in the first place. This inconsistency, being convicted of adultery against a marriage the Church simultaneously declared had never validly existed, is one of the clearest signs, to modern legal historians, of just how politically constructed the entire process was. Anne Boleyn was executed on the morning of May 19, 1536, on Tower Green within the walls of the Tower of London, spared the usual public execution site to keep the event smaller and more controlled. In an unusual act of what some historians read as a final mercy, or possibly guilt, from Henry, he had arranged for a highly skilled swordsman to be brought specifically from Calais, in France, rather than using the standard English executioner's axe. Beheading by sword was considered faster and less prone to a botched multiple strike execution, the method used for context for French nobility, and considered a more dignified death. Contemporary accounts describe Anne addressing the small crowd of witnesses before her death with a short, careful speech, one that, notably, did not protest her innocence outright. Likely because doing so publicly could have endangered her daughter Elizabeth, or been seen as treasonous defiance, but instead spoke generally of accepting her fate and praying for the king. She was blindfolded and knelt upright, this style of execution, kneeling rather than laying the head on a block, was itself unusual for England and specifically associated with the French method the swordsman used. Witnesses recorded that the execution was completed with a single stroke. Her body and severed head were placed in an arrow chest because, in a detail that speaks volumes about how quickly and quietly this execution had been arranged, no coffin had been prepared. She was buried in an unmarked grave inside the chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula, within the Tower of London grounds, where her remains are still located today, later identified during Victorian-era renovations of the chapel floor in the 1870s. 11 days later, on May 30th, 1536, Henry VIII married Jane Seymour. So here's the real question this video has been building toward. Was any of it true? The overwhelming consensus among modern historians is no, that the charges against Anne Boleyn were fabricated or at minimum wildly exaggerated as part of a deliberate political operation, most likely orchestrated by Thomas Cromwell to remove a queen who had become both politically inconvenient and personally dangerous to cross. Several separate lines of reasoning support this conclusion. The timing is too convenient. Henry had already grown infatuated with Jane Seymour and was, by early 1536, clearly looking for a way out of his marriage to Anne, much as he had looked for a way out of his marriage to Catherine years earlier. The sudden emergence of treason-level charges, arriving at the exact moment Henry needed an exit, mirrors a pattern. The specific charges were, in several instances, demonstrably impossible, given documented royal itineraries and the specific dates listed in the indictment. A level of sloppiness that suggests the charges were constructed for political effect, rather than built from genuine, carefully verified evidence. Only one of 5 accused men ever confessed, and that confession came under deeply questionable circumstances at Cromwell's own house rather than through standard legal process, while the other 4 men, including Anne's own brother, maintained their innocence even facing certain death, when confessing, as some legal historians note, might realistically have offered them a chance at leniency. Cromwell himself later effectively admitted to engineering the fall. In conversations recorded by the imperial ambassador Chapuys, Cromwell described having personally devised the plot against Anne, framing it as necessary political strategy to secure her removal. The Archbishop's own annulment of the marriage declaring Anne had never validly been Henry's wife at all logically contradicts the adultery conviction, since adultery requires a valid marriage in the first place. Few historians believe anyone involved actually cared about this contradiction. It simply reveals how loosely constructed the whole legal process really was. To be fair to the historical record, there remains a small minority of historians, most notably the historian G.W. Bernard, who have argued that at least some of the charges, particularly regarding Anne's alleged relationship with Mark Smeaton, may have had some basis in fact, based on close readings of court gossip and behaviour recorded at the time. But this remains a minority position. The dominant scholarly consensus held by historians such as Eric Ives and Retha Warnicke, whose major biographies of Anne remain the standard academic references, is that Anne Boleyn was the victim of a coordinated political execution, not a woman who had genuinely committed treason. Anne Boleyn's daughter, Elizabeth, was only 2 years old when her mother was executed. She was declared illegitimate by an Act of Parliament shortly afterward, technically stripped of her place in the line of succession, much like her older half-sister Mary had been years earlier after Catherine of Aragon's marriage was annulled. And yet, through a combination of political manoeuvring, the deaths of her siblings, and her own considerable political skill, Elizabeth would go on to inherit the throne in 1558, ruling as Queen Elizabeth I, for 45 years, one of the most consequential reigns in English history, presiding over the defeat of the Spanish Armada, the flourishing of English literature under writers like Shakespeare, and a lasting reputation as one of England's greatest monarchs. It's worth sitting with that for a moment. The daughter born out of a marriage so urgently, desperately wanted, that it triggered a religious revolution, and then so quickly discarded that her own mother was executed within 3 years, ended up becoming one of the most powerful and celebrated rulers England has ever had. Henry VIII would go on to marry 4 more times after Jane Seymour, who herself died shortly after finally giving him the son he wanted, Edward VI, Anne of Cleves, Catherine Howard, who was also, notably, executed, and finally Catherine Parr, who outlived him. 6 wives in total, a rhyme most English schoolchildren still learn today: divorced, beheaded, died, divorced, beheaded, survived. So after everything we've walked through, where does that leave Anne Boleyn? A woman who reshaped the religious future of an entire nation simply by refusing to become a mistress. A queen who gave birth to one of history's most celebrated monarchs. And ultimately, a woman executed on charges that most historians today believe were essentially fabricated by a legal and political system that had absolutely no meaningful protections for her once the king decided she was no longer useful to him. What do you think genuine political conspiracy, or is there more to the Mark Smeaton confession than we give it credit for? Let me know in the comments, because the debate over Anne Boleyn's guilt is one that professional historians still haven't fully settled, and I'd genuinely like to hear your take. If you enjoyed this one, make sure you're subscribed with notifications on, because we've barely scratched the surface of the Tudor court. And there are at least 5 more true stories from this exact period that are just as wild as this one. Thank you for watching all the way through. I'll see you in the next one.